Do you hear me? Oh, now you hear me. Good. I hear myself, so you hear me as well. Good evening. My name is Karlis Bukovskis. I'm with the Latvian Institute of National Affairs, and it's an utmost pleasure of mine to see the house packed. Basically, we're a bit scared that because of the weather, because it's Friday evening, and because it's online as well. So those of you who are watching us online, hello, nice to see you as well. And whichever camera I should be looking at. And so we're gonna have a excellent discussion today, that I can promise, because the panelists are just perfect and wonderful. This is a discussion which is taking place in the framework of the annual Riga Dialogue. This was is the 9th year that the Riga Dialogue has been taking place. It is organized by the Latvian Institute of National Affairs together with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in the Baltic states and a Nuclear Threat Initiative and European Leadership Network. The title of the event is Transatlantic Security from Madrid to Vilnius. Sounds like a travel itinerary, doesn't it? And I was thinking that, yeah, well, it sounds a little bit like that, but it also is like that, because it's a road that the NATO has been taking, that our security has been taking this year to the next year, from this year's summit to the next year's summit, right? So in this case, it is a long and winding road. It usually is. Usually it is walked by diplomats. Well, this year it looks like everyone is walking this road, and unfortunately this is not only a diplomatic negotiation, it is also a bloody and painful experience for many people in the world. In particular, of course, I'm talking about Ukrainians. So we had a very productive discussion today under the Chatham House rule. So I'm going to tell you a couple of points that we came to the conclusions about, so that to put you in the framework where we were today about the Chatham House. So I cannot tell you who said what, right? So there were different opinions, a lot of different opinions. Of course, that is part of the debate. Some were convinced that Ukraine will push Russia out of Crimea very soon. Most positive outlook. Some say that the likelihood of the use of the nuclear weapons is small and that it would not actually create any tactical advantages to Russia if suddenly that happens. That was the elephant in the room today, of course, during the discussion. Some recognize the European Union as a capable actor during this defending and struggling against Russia, especially from the economic perspective. Some were at the same time not writing off Russia and its military at the moment, saying that there are still very much the possibility that regrouping and in time actually works in Russia's advantage. Some had very gloomy perspectives about Russia and about its politics, even in case if Putin disappears, meaning that even if there is no Putin, Russia is still and Russian population is still a potential imperialistic thinking which is present and which has been cultivated over the decades while Putin has been there. Some had sad perspectives about the domestic processes in Russia and a warning that the mass mobilization is still a possibility, that it cannot be excluded because this is just the way it is. So some concluded that we are tested as societies and that the societal resilience, the resilience of us as a societies is being tested at the moment. And most importantly, that's the most important point, some concluded that we as experts are being tested. Our skills, our knowledge, our understanding of Russia is being tested. Of course, there's immediately the question, can we understand Russia if we're not fully sure if Russians understand themselves nowadays, right? So that's another thing to be taken into account. So we have, as I said, exquisite panelists today to offer you, and I hope for a great discussion with them. They're going to each have 7 minutes, up to 7 minutes initial remarks. They have their own microphone, so I'm thinking that could be a logistical nightmare for me as a moderator to take that away, but they promise that they're going to be on time. But we have Dr. Margarita Šešelgytė, Director of the Institute of National Relations Political Science at the Vilnius University, and also Honorary Fellow at the Baltic Defense College. That's what's not on the invitation, so I'm giving you additional information. So Then Robert Nurik, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in the United States, and also, among many, many things, also the former Director of Carnegie Moscow Center. Tatjana Ildem. Yes, correct. Yes, I was instructed how to pronounce the name, so now I'm happy. Chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, and also former Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at the NATO. Sven Salkov, Ambassador of Estonia to Finland, and formerly also Director of the International Center of Defense and Security, or ICDS, in Estonia. And Dr. Walter Kemp, Director of Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and also formerly head of the Strategic Policy Support Unit at the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So, Margarita, if you have the microphone, everything is organized.
I do have, and it works.
If you could start with a general take on how the transatlantic security situation has changed during the 2020, and there is this old saying that if you want peace, prepare for war. Has this become the new reality in which we're living?
Thank you, Carlos, for the question. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. And it's a very interesting topic, and I have this thesis that although what happened on February 24 was very bad for Ukraine and Europe and for the world in general, it had a positive effect for the transatlantic relations. So not all is bad in this world, and the war can have also a good impact on some things. Prior to that, we know that transatlantic relations have been damaged by Trump's administration, and there was a very high level of uncertainty, in particular in those countries whose security depended heavily on the US presence in the region, on one hand, but also the climate in the relations between the Americans and Europeans was tainted. With the election of Biden, of course, this climate has changed a bit, and where everyone was nice to each other, but the number of issues under the discussion, under the dispute remained. For instance, the lack of sufficient finances going for the defense in a number of countries in Europe, super over-reliance on energy resources coming from Russia, a lot of criticism vis-a-vis Nord Stream. So there were a number of issues which were tainting transatlantic relations, and here we have February 24, the new reality that was eye-opening for many countries. Many countries did not believe that the full-scale war is even possible in Europe. And I can tell also on my side, even in the Baltics, we said, probably we will have a conflict, but not the full scale. He wouldn't dare, it's not rational. But then suddenly our eyes were opened and we woke up to the new reality. And one of the premises, I guess, what Putin has made going to this war was that Europeans would not stay united for a long time. And after some time, the unity would crumble, and he would able to play that, manipulate that, and he would not be punished for this war. But it did not happen. European Union has reacted quite swiftly and harshly. In 4 days, decisions were taken. That's very fast for European Union. We have 6 sanctions packages, including the most vulnerable resources for European Union, like oil and gas. And still, although there are some, disagreements over the sanctions before they are being imposed, the unity is standing. We'll see what's going to happen in autumn when the bills would start arriving to the houses of the European citizens, and there are already protests in Czech Republic, in Italy, people claiming that they won't pay the bills. And if there are a number of elections in the European countries next year, Czech Republic, Italy, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and at the end of the next year, and of course, these societal dissatisfactions would be manipulated by Russia. I think that we can say it for sure. The U.S. intelligence just released the information that $300 million have been pumped into all sorts of friendly agents all over Europe over the last years. So things might not be so rosy in autumn, but as I said, European Union has reacted in a swift and harsh manner. So there are sanctions, and there is unity to isolate Putin, and what is the most important, to help Ukraine militarily and economically. Coming back to the disagreements between the United States and European partners that I was referring at the beginning, first of all, in defense spending. I think that, I hope that there is a realization in Europe, si vis pacem para bellum, you have to invest in your security, and you see defense budget increases in a number of countries. Germany, the country which has been criticized in the harshest manner during the Trump's presidency as the one who spends too little, had taken steps to increase, major steps, monumental steps to increase defense budget. On the other hand, we can talk about also the military aid going to Ukraine. Of course, it's too little, too late, sometimes not what Ukrainians are asking, but I think it's a major step for European countries to even contemplate doing this, on one hand on the bilateral basis, but on the other hand using European Union money as a peace facility money to help Ukraine with the arms. So that's, we have seen awakening. We will see how long it will, how sustainable it will be, but that's a good sign, and I think that it's partly solving certain disagreement that existed before this war. Another, energy dependence on Russia. Although we still see that a number of European countries cannot avoid buying energy resources from Russia, in particular in the sector of gas, because you cannot just change the tubes in a day and get the gas from different resources. But as if you have listened to the State of the Union speech of Ursula von der Leyen, and she mentioned that over the last months, the dependency of European Union countries, dependency on Russia in gas sector dropped from 40 to 9%, and it's huge. And that was done with a very strong political will and understanding the consequences that it will have on society. We don't talk about Nord Stream 2 any longer. I think that European Union are making major steps in that direction, and again, disagreements that existed, well, we are going to the direction of solving these disagreements. Oh, so how much time do I have? Zero. Oh, you should have warned me. Yes, but a number of issues will still be important, and one hand is relations with China. I think that that was one of the issues that visions of the US and European Union were different before the conflict, and so far they didn't change much. plus having suffering from economic stagnation and high energy prices, Europeans would be less reluctant to have worsening relations with China. So this will stay. Another important thing is that economic stagnation might have an impact on the European states' commitment to spend more on defense, and that also could be the issue. And then they will be still relying on the U.S. support. And I'm referring to the forthcoming summit in Vilnius. Two things. It is very important that Europeans would stick to what they have committed in Madrid, and that commitments would not be the paper commitments, but they will be supported by the real armed forces. If it's not going to happen, those countries which feel insecure will look at the United States, and that will be again one issue of tensions. And last but not least, I think that we have 2 years to do the homework to improve these relations, because after 2 years there will be an election in the United States, and God knows what's going to happen. So 2 years to support Ukraine, to make Ukraine win, and two years to work on transatlantic relations to make them very solid and strong. That's it.
Thank you, Margarita, very much. Thank you for outlining the challenges that we have been going through and will continue going through. You know, let's kick off the debate with something very provocative. And one of your first points, you said that when the whole attack on Ukraine was accelerated, because of course it started in 2014, and in 2020 it just became more massive. Putin was rational; he wasn't mad. Now looking 6 months later, the question is there something that actually can push him to the brink of madness?
I'm not a psychologist or doctor, so it's very difficult to contemplate on this issue. But I think that he was rational in his own way by starting this war, and he still is rational in his way of what he's doing now. So I already said at the beginning that, you know, he just made the wrong premises, and that affected the final outcome, what's happening. He believed that the European unity would crumble. He believed that Ukraine is almost a failed state, that the institutions would stop working. He believed that the government of Ukraine probably would flee. He believed that parts of Ukraine, the people would be welcoming him with the flowers, and he believed that, you know, Western countries would not send so much military aid to Ukraine. So when you make these premises, the conflict doesn't look so irrational. If you want to make a great history or recreate the empire, or punish Ukrainian president, because there is also this line that, you know, Putin really hates Ukrainian president. First of all, he believes that Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist, and this young president has challenged him. So, you know, so that's a moment of probably irrationality that exists in this warfare.
Okay, thank you. Bob, let's continue with Russia in this case. Now, seeing exactly what has happened, the successful counterattacks of Ukraine, has Russia depleted its military capacities? Has it lost its respect globally? Has it learned its lessons, or is this currently just a, so to speak, if I may use the phrase, calm before storm?
Well, let me start with the obvious. Those are very, very big questions, cover a lot of territory, including a lot of our earlier discussions. Given the time constraints, I will try to address them in more or less in headline form, and look to amend, elaborate, clarify in the following discussions. Let me start with the first one. about whether or not Russia has depleted its military capabilities. This in many ways is the easiest one to answer, and the answer is yes. And it's been extensive. The estimates of manpower killed and wounded are very high. They vary. Not all the estimates are, I think, equally credible, but the numbers, credible numbers, are still very high. And include a considerable portion of the forces that they have not only committed to the Ukraine battle, but are currently available to them, period. It's also the case that they've lost an awful lot of equipment. Neither of these are going to be easy to reproduce. Not impossible. Russia's a big country. It's got industry. But for example, on the manpower side, there's been a lot of speculation that perhaps Mr. Putin will call for a general mobilization. He could do that. There are political risks in doing so. I'll come back to those in a moment. But even if he did so, it would take many, many months, anywhere from, I would say, 6 to 9 months, not only to mobilize them, but to train them. It will also take a long time, at least that long, to start to replace some of the serious equipment that they've lost. Now, they still have a lot. There are things that they can do. They still have a lot of artillery, and so I'm not. I would like to be wrong about this, but I don't expect in the short and medium term less barrages on southern Ukrainian territory. But again, the overall picture for them is much less favorable than it was some time ago. And again, and just one final point about it. In addition to the general overall numbers, I'm sure many of you will have read about the recent debacle in the Kharkiv area, where troops not only got beaten, but the ones who didn't get beaten ran away, left their equipment. And the point about this is that in all my time when I was in Moscow dealing with people in and around the security policy community, the units there, namely the 1st Tank Guard Army, as it's called, it's one of the elite units in the Russian military. So this cannot bode well for them. Now, I should also add to this that there are constraints on the Ukrainian side as well. Some of them have to do with equipment, and as Margarita mentioned, it's going to be important for the West to continue to supply them. But there are limits also to that they'll have to train soldiers. So there's going to be a bit of a there's going to be a bit of a balancing act for both of them. I think the most likely outcome in the medium term is a kind of a war of attrition, where Russia will not attempt to do the kinds of incursions that it started the war with. It will continue to bombard in the south. One of the big questions we should come back to is whether at some point they will call for a ceasefire to hold the areas that they currently control. Now, what about, have they lost respect globally? Here, I think the answer actually is a bit more complicated. It would be yes, no, and maybe. Yes, certainly if you look at the West, at the transatlantic community. Although again, the lack of confidence, the concerns, the suspicions about where Moscow was going and what their intentions were actually started before February 24th. But there's no question that they've accelerated and, as Margarita said, have really created a kind of solidarity about these issues which didn't exist before. It's not immutable. It's one of the concerns that a lot of Western planners and analysts have, that there may be circumstances in which some of the solidarity may start to wane, and certainly there's a belief that Mr. Putin is going to do what he can to identify and widen any cracks that he can find. But in the meantime, the effect has been great. No, in another part of the world, namely Africa, and much of the Middle East. Now, we don't look at this very much, but the Russians do. It's not nearly as important to them. I don't think it's as existentially important to Mr. Putin as Europe and the transatlantic community, but they have important interests, including trade and interests, and they are starting to re-engage. They've been much more active, just in the last month or so, taking diplomatic initiatives there. The interesting and complicated maybe question is China. I think China for quite some time has been wary of Russia. They have been very careful not to criticize Russian behavior, at least not so far. Indeed, they came out very early after the February 24th incursions, not saying that the invasion was a wise thing to do, but that they understood Russia's concerns about NATO enlargement, et cetera, about Russia's place in the European security order, and so on. There have been just in the last few days a meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping. The reporting there is a little bit sketchy, but the main headlines in CNN have been Mr. Xi expressed concern. Now, concern about what exactly is not entirely clear, whether it was about the fact of the invasion, whether it's about whether the fact that Russia might be losing or not doing nearly as well as they thought. This remains to be clarified. But I think what we can expect is that China will continue to try to do this balancing act. It's not going to, barring some major catastrophe, we're not going to see him criticizing Russia in any serious way. But it's not also, I think, not going to jump in physically to aid them. It's going to try to stay out of this. Has it learned its lessons? I'll try to be quick about this. The question is here, which Russia you're talking about?
Bob, just yes or no? Has it learned its lessons or not?
It depends what Russia you're talking about. There's several Russias here. And this is what I want.
Okay, you have 17 minutes.
All right. I'll again be quick. If you look at the military, they made a very early operational adaptation, the results of which you're seeing. They're not going to be doing any multi-pronged incursions of the sort that they started with. What they've reverted to is something they know how to do, which is massive artillery barrages. We saw this in Grozny. We saw this in World War II. And if you look at the history of Russian military training and doctrine, any incursion, any offensive begins with a massive barrage. And that's what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. It's unfortunate. It's creating horrific damage. But this, on that level, they're much more comfortable than they were before. What's the bigger question has to do with, of course, with whether Mr. Putin has learned his lessons. I don't see so far any particularly, there's certainly no public indication that he's going to backtrack. To the contrary. And indeed, this is a case where I have a slightly different view than Margarita. Not that I think he's irrational, but that I think that rational calculus is not the only thing going on here. I should, just to explain, I was one of those up until about a month before the invasion. I thought that on balance that they would not invade. I wasn't sure about this. It was not crazy to be certain. But I just thought it was from his own point of view, too counterproductive. What started to change my mind were a couple of things, but the main ones was listening and watching two talks that Mr. Putin gave, one to foreign audiences, one to domestic audiences. And what was striking was the fact, not only the words, but the sheer emotional intensity of these presentations. And what this told me was, yes, there's a calculus going on. But that's not the only thing going on. What he's doing was not only something in his head, but also something in his stomach. And I think that is still there. Finally, very quickly on calm before the storm, I don't think we're in a calm now. One of the big issues is whether they'll try to get some kind of ceasefire in place. It will be resisted by Ukrainians and others on the simple grounds that this will simply give them, barring any other real positive outcomes, that a simple ceasefire in place will give them the opportunity to regroup and try again. So let me stop there.
Thank you. You took my joke about 17 minutes quite literally, but nevertheless, it's a wonderful intervention. Thank you so much for all the explanations. I have also a follow-up question to you, but in this case, maybe just yes or no type of the question. I know it's a complicated one. Can we here, meaning here and in the rest of the Western world, because of the depleted Russian military capabilities, feel ourselves safe? Because one thing is NATO, protection, our own defense capabilities, but does Russia still have the firepower to do something to us?
Well, it has the firepower, but I mean, it would be wildly irrational for them. I mean, if we're talking about NATO, I would be astonished. Now, I've been wrong before, but this, unless they're completely delusional now, this is not something that they would risk. It was not something that they were risking even before they lost so many men and materiel in the Ukraine incursions. So things could go wrong. I can imagine, there are a number of scenarios people worry about it, so-called inadvertent escalation. If, for example, the one that's the least implausible one to me is if they really start losing badly. The Ukrainians, now that they're getting longer range artillery, start hitting more on Russian territory. The Russians strike back, including in some areas, maybe not necessarily intending to hit the Baltic states or Poland, but one of the things, one of the problems they have is that a lot of their artillery and long-range missiles are not very precise. So again, I think this is quite unlikely, but less implausible than others.
Thank you. Well, as you indicated that NATO is still important, so Tatjana, I turn to you and then with the question, well, 2022 developments for NATO as an organization. Is it now the situation that we need it more than ever?
Well, I think
7 minutes, please.
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. And in that respect, the summit meeting in Madrid was a historic and transformative summit. We have to recognize the fact that we are now in a much different security environment, which requires NATO to adapt itself to the new circumstances. And I think Madrid summit meeting provided the necessary basis for us to be confident regarding what it could offer to individual allied nations, but also in our cooperation with our partners. There are a couple of things which I could perhaps highlight. First, we remember NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg talking about the necessity to commit to deterrence and defense. He qualified it to be a reset for the alliance. And I think this is good to see a shift in our focus to collective defense without losing sight of other threats and challenges, because if we talk about one threat, Russia, the other one is terrorism, and we have other challenges like China. And when we look at the decisions that were taken at Madrid summit meeting, in order to boost deterrence and defense, we see a very right decision to enlarge the scope of enhanced forward presence in addition to 4 countries, the Baltics and Poland. Now there are 4 additional countries, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria and Romania, and also to scale up the existing battle groups to brigade-sized formations when and where it requires. Second important pillar, I think, is to see the readiness level of NATO. And there is, in all these decisions, the necessity to have more high readiness forces. Within 10 days, NATO could be able to have high readiness forces 100,000, and the number of NATO response force was increased from 40,000 to 300,000. So there is now a new force model, as we call it, with different tiers. The second tier talks about 10 to 30 days of deployment period for 200,000, and yet another 500,000 would be between the period from 30 days to 180 days. These are all solid evidences that NATO would be focusing on collective defense. The third pillar is prepositioning of more equipment, stockpiles in frontline nations. And it is essential to think about the needed weaponry for the defense of these countries. What NATO Summit had brought about for Ukraine was also important. We are talking about direct assistance from individual countries, not only allied NATO nations, but partners. And there is now a contact group, Ukraine contact group, which regularly convenes to coordinate efforts. And it is important for NATO countries and partners to sustain this assistance. And I think the recent developments in favor of Ukraine will also give assurance and confidence for those countries giving this assistance that it is paving the way for changing the balance on the ground. There is also NATO effort. We had a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which had been scaled up at Madrid Summit meeting, and it will provide the necessary basis for NATO to provide non-lethal weapons, strategic communications equipment, command and control facilities, and other equipment that we may think of. Now, also important is to look at what NATO had started the discussion regarding the defense spending. The 2% of the GDP to be allocated to defense spending is now considered to be bottom, but not a ceiling. And there are a number of allied countries who have already contemplated ways and means to increase their commitment. Poland is one example that I recall. And it would be essential from Madrid to Vilnius summit meeting, as Margarita has said, to focus on our homework. We need to deliver all the promises made, all the commitments undertaken, so that it is not going to be a rhetorical exercise, but a solid evidence that NATO is prepared for any eventuality. I have to also mention, when talking about defense spending, Allies' decision to increase common funding, and it is so crucial. As a member of NATO 2030 experts group, I was part of a debate on that, and we, those who were advocating the need, were right, without knowing what would happen with Russia. One last thing I have to highlight, since I mentioned NATO 2030 exercise reflection process, strategic concept. It was a major development, a major deliverable of Madrid Summit meeting, because it also gives us a direction. It's a strategic document which will guide NATO for some time, and in this 11-page short document, and I compare with Strategic Compass, which is 47 pages, like an action plan rather than a strategic document, it gives us all necessary vision and direction that NATO should have, not only on Russia, which is considered to be most significant and direct threat to the security of allies, but also China as a challenge with its coercive policies and stated ambitions.
Thank you, Dajan, very much. Technical issue. Okay, I can, yeah, if you could, I can ask the question nevertheless. You said that member states are looking for the NATO assurances, right? And this is normal. But I want to see from the other side what assurances NATO as an organization is looking from the member states. Today we discussed that. Is there even well, there is a chance that the next U.S. administration, for instance, decides that, yeah, well, we don't need NATO, right? Is that what NATO is afraid mostly of? Yeah, Bob is already shaking his head. No, that's not going to happen. But what NATO needs from the member states?
Well, I think maybe I take that one because yes. Well, I think NATO allies should demonstrate their commitment to the alliance, and I believe that if one thing unwittingly Putin has fostered, it was the unity of allies, and I believe that Madrid Summit also gave them the assurance that their defense, and it is in the communique declaration of the leaders at the end of the summit they issued, that every inch of allied nations would be important and it would be protected. Of course, it's a solid commitment, and we can always refer to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. There is a sense of unity and cohesion which need to be bolstered in the months and years to come.
Thank you, Dajan, very much. Sven, I'm now turning to you. Yeah, switch the mics. Troubling times can, of course, also be opportunities. So in this case, I'm asking you as an Estonian ambassador to Finland, intentionally, what are the used opportunities of this whole security problems that we're living in, and what are the missed opportunities?
Well, thank you, Carlis, and thank you for a great event. One of my favorite ones, of course, after Lennart Meri conference. I will start with two personal recollections. One is from another event, not Riga Dialogue, in Riga, maybe 3 years ago, when I asked the speaker the following simple question, regarding what you all say about what Russia is doing. When is Latvia going to reinstate conscription? And I was answered, I know this. This is what we called an Estonian question. And the answer was no, we're not going to do it. Maybe 5 years ago, I asked also a very simple question from someone in an event, probably a Finnish International Affairs Institute event in Helsinki, saying that, is there any chance that Finland will be joining NATO one day? In a study on that, they just Google my name, ICDS, and air defense of the Baltic states. Defense spending is up in the whole region, and I think kind of those things are really on the positive side. What is missed opportunities, basically what is negative, is I would say that in general we are right now, and by we I mean the whole of Europe, the West, we are paying for the mistakes what we have done since 2008, when 1/5 of the Georgian territory was basically militarily taken away, and 7 months later, Lavrov was gifted this infamous reset button by Hillary Clinton. And we're still paying for that. And I think that basically put a lot of other things into motion. Now, we hear a lot of people saying in further west that, well, we should have listened to Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Poles when they warned us about Russia. And our plea to those people is, please listen to us now. You are not, because now you still know better, even though you have been wrong at every point in the last 20 years or 30 years about Russia. So I think there's quite a arrogance or chutzpah on that side. And for future, I think the Madrid Summit decisions, good decisions, need to be implemented. I think one thing what we have seen on the defense military side in NATO is that the stocks are low and industry capacity is low for the large-scale industrial-scale war. The infrastructure, energy connections need to be beefed up more. Rail Baltic, electricity desynchronization, and our own production capacity and storage capacity. There is a huge potential for the future of the Nordic-Baltic defense cooperation now inside NATO. I hope no one in Finland is listening. I do feel basically sad when there is talk in Finland and Sweden about the Nordic cluster or a Nordic NATO. And I'm telling my Finnish friends that, look, your defining characteristic or character inside NATO is not going to be this kind of a value-based, nice Nordic Scandinavian family, but will be 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, doubling the NATO-Russia border. And the
Thank you.
Last thing is that it is all, let's say, of course, depends on how it will end, the war. My own kind of thinking is that Russia is living through a Hiroshima moment right now. And let's think back of what it meant for the Russian society back in 1905. And one more sentence about NATO. As a NATO cohesion, as my Turkish friend said, has made us more cohesive. And I would say that we need to, in NATO headquarters, erect, this is a joke of course, erect a monument for 3 people who have kept NATO together and alive. Those are Slobodan Milosevic, Osama bin Laden, and Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sven. You don't have to answer every question that has been raised, but thank you for doing that. And I'm kind of amazed that it takes two ambassadors to answer my question. So in this case, it's lovely that the audience is already...
Changing the light bulb.
Yes, exactly. But there's one. But please, if we can keep it very, very, very short. One thing which is on the mind. Finland joining, Sweden joining. What about the military interoperability? Is it so compatible? It's easily going to go?
No, this is absolutely compatible. There is no issue and no question about that. This is, I mean, easy question. Yes.
Yeah. Good. Walter, I'm turning to you. We have talked about the military security a lot, but in this case, of course, the military security has been somewhat taken care of. You're an expert on, so to speak, not necessarily hard security issues as well. So in this case, I would actually ask you to comment. What are the unconventional threats that we will be dealing with in, well, this year and next year because of the whole security situation in the transatlantic community?
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you all for your patience. I'm the last person on a panel at the end of a long day on a Friday evening, and I'm very aware that I'm sitting right beside the moderator, so I will keep to 7 minutes. I want to do two things. One, I want to talk about some of the bigger picture issues that we've been discussing here, and also to answer your specific question. But just to begin on a personal note, it's great to be back in Latvia. I'm a Canadian of Latvian descent. I was working here briefly in 1992 when I was about the age of those gentlemen at the back there. But if I spoke Latvian, you would understand why I didn't have a very long career in the Latvian Foreign Service. Nevertheless, that was a time of hope, a time of change. And when you think now about the recent death of Mikhail Gorbachev, looking back at that period, what seemed impossible and how quickly change came and how there was this hope about an era of peace and unity in Europe, sadly that's evaporated in the last 30 years. What we were discussing today is that the Euro-Atlantic partnership is probably stronger than ever, certainly stronger than a few years ago when President Macron described NATO as brain dead and President Trump was thinking about walking away. But pan-European security is more fragile than it has been since the early 1990s, perhaps since the end of the Second World War. Cooperative security has become unfashionable, if not impossible, in the short term. And as Mark Galeotti has written, we see the weaponization of almost everything, of energy, of information, even migration and trade. Even suggesting the need for dialogue in some quarters is seen as appeasement. But as somebody mentioned in our discussions today, diplomats are paid to talk to their enemies and not just to their friends. And one thing that I have heard about the Riga Dialogue, and I have to say this is my first time here, is that it's very open to a diversity of views, and we did hear that today. And let me make a couple of points which may not be the consensus view, but there was no consensus today. I think that was one of our takeaways. The day will eventually come when Russia and Ukraine have to make peace. And Latvians know full well that you can't choose your neighbors. You have to find a way to get along. And Russia is not going to go away, even if it's defeated. That's the nature of geography. So we need to think about the day after the end of the war, and that's something that we were talking about briefly today, although obviously we don't know what that would look like and when it will be. On what basis can relations between Russia and the West be rebuilt? What security guarantees can there be for Ukraine or for countries that are not in NATO, like Georgia and Moldova, for example? How can political relations and military relations be made more predictable and transparent? Can confidence in security building measures lead to a new generation of arms control agreements? And can we get back to that rules-based system that we had with the Helsinki Final Act and which has been destroyed in the last few years. On the 23rd of February, I was in The Hague to do a launch of my book, which is called Security Through Cooperation. And people said at the time, I'm not sure if this is the best time or the worst time to launch a book called Security Through Cooperation. So it may be a work of fiction, but nevertheless, Carlos, I'd like you to have one. I can sign it later. But I think we will eventually have to get back to talking about some form of peaceful coexistence. And in that respect, I would not only look to the Vilnius Summit, but perhaps a couple of years later in Helsinki, the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. What would that look like? How would you prepare for it? I think it's not too early to be thinking about that day. The time is not ripe to have that discussion, obviously, but we need some ideas in the drawer. And somebody mentioned in our discussion today, it's worth recalling that the discussion about the creation of the United Nations started in 1943, in the darkest days of the Second World War. And so we need to start thinking over the horizon. At the same time, to answer your question, I think there are a number of things which we also have to keep in mind which go beyond the traditional security issues. You won't be surprised to hear me say that organized crime is one of them. The impact of state-embedded actors, the link between organized crime and corruption, you could call it organized corruption, and the dangers of when business, political, and criminal elites all start working in collusion. And there are some countries in Europe that have this problem already. The impact of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, not least on nuclear weapons. Climate issues, the need for disaster risk reduction. I think there's a lot of scope for cooperation there. The impact of private security companies. We focus a lot on the Wagner Group in different parts of the world, but there are other threats and challenges in the whole privatization of the security space. The manipulation of popular discontent, especially if this is a hard winter. And finally, somehow related to that, disruption of infrastructure, either through cyber attacks or sabotage. So yes, we have enough to think about. There are even more black swans or black elephants that we have to keep in mind. But there are plenty of other issues on which countries need to find some basis for cooperation. Think about the Iran nuclear talks, or we have some hope in small agreements like the shipments of grain, climate change and other things. So eventually there will have to be a pendulum swing back towards effective multilateralism. We're not there yet, but the current war shows that we are interdependent, and eventually, if we're going to survive, we're going to find a way to cooperate.
Thank you. You have still a minute to go. I'm surprised. But thank you. No, Walter, thank you very much. I was just at one point taken by the fact that what security guarantees can we provide to Ukraine after the war is over? And I was thinking that now Ukraine is providing security to us now. They're guaranteeing our security already now. So no, it's just that it's somewhat an epiphany coming out of what you were saying. But I would like to ask a bit more elaborate maybe comment on the fact that we have been in academic community thinking about it's like corruption, organized corruption, and Russia is famous or infamous for organized corruption, and now we currently have seen so much that the corruption in the military has actually turned out to be a rather useful vulnerability. So would you agree with that, or would you say that no, they should have been more careful with corruption?
No, in that particular case, it cuts both ways. But we recently came out with the first ever global index of organized crime. It's quite telling that the countries that were number 1 and number 2 in Europe were Russia and Ukraine. So you can see that the impact of corruption and organized crime, not least through state-embedded actors, has a big impact on stability, on governance, but also on statecraft. How predictable can countries be in their relations if they have those type of interests?
Thank you. Colleagues, it's time for your questions now. Those of us who are watching us online, there's a Slido option to send the questions. Then they're going to be resent to me to my phone. If there are some, I haven't checked in a while. In a moment, just a second. So please, colleagues, prepare your questions. Be ready to answer them. Tatiana is going to do some remarks in 15 seconds, and then the floor is yours. The audience, then the floor is yours. Can, go first.
Well, since I'm the only Turk on this panel, and since Finland and Sweden were referred to several times, perhaps I shouldn't shy away from making some comments on that. First of all, as in my national capacity as permanent representative to NATO, and I'm so happy to see Yanis Aikmanis, with whom I was on the council together, and in my international capacity as NATO Assistant Secretary General, I witnessed a very solid partnership between NATO and these two countries. So their decision to join NATO, their aspirations to join NATO, is a historical one, and we have to applaud them in making this decision. Nevertheless, we need to understand that as much as their security is important, those countries who are already within the alliance have certain security concerns, and security is indivisible, as we all know. Therefore, the legitimate security concerns of Turkey have to be addressed during this accession process. And we are not talking about the delay of this process. It is still within the bounds of ratification processes going on in different countries. You referred to 4 remaining. So we are not late yet. I don't want to suggest anything of a prolongation, but we have to remember that in the case of North Macedonia, it took more than 10 years for them to exit. I'm not suggesting at all any delay in that sense. But the trilateral mechanism provides the necessary principles for 3 countries to refer to, but there is also a mechanism which also gave the opportunity for these 3 countries to engage with each other. And I am hopeful that with goodwill, and when these 2 countries show their genuine desire to be cooperating with Turkey in fight against terrorism, there wouldn't be any reason for Turkey to block their accession to NATO, which will strengthen their security, but the security of NATO as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. Although I think the case of Northern Macedonia and the case of Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO are quite different, because Northern Macedonia at that point, when they were not, it wasn't under threat that currently
I know, but
Finland
when we talk about security, it can be a threat as such, as you referred to, or an abstract one. And it does not eliminate the necessity to address those concerns of individual allies. Otherwise, we may have a differentiated formula for accession, saying, well, this is not the time to raise any issue, you have to accept these countries. No, this doesn't work that way. Does it work in the EU, insofar as enlargement is concerned? No, I don't think so. We have to be candid, frank with each other.
Okay. No, it's just, we need a debate, but there is time for a lengthy debate and there's a time for a very, very short debate. So that's I guess, there's a major difference. Questions, please, colleagues. Yes, please. Microphone. The name, please, so that everybody who doesn't know you yet.
Hamid Lajavardi. Thank you for the panelists for their enlightening presentation. My question concerns Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and the interrelationship. First, can you imagine a scenario down the line where Ukraine has says they have to win, they will win, and Russia more or less has said the same thing? Is there some line down the future, some scenario where you think both can claim that they have won and come to a ceasefire? Germany and Russia have had what I would call a love-hate relationship. There's a strong special interest in Germany of Russian interest, protecting it, promoting it. I was speaking with a gentleman from EU, a senior person, and they said the Germans are having soul searching to see where they stand. They had relatively cheap energy, low-cost euro, low-cost defense. So they had a nice ride, and that's changing. Is the soul searching for real, or is just a temporary phenomenon until the Russian-Ukrainian conflict comes to some sort of a end or ceasefire?
Thank you. Thank you. Who wants to go with the answer? Yeah, Tachan, yeah, go first, and then Margarita, and then Sven. Okay.
Well, I think international community should always think about the value of certain fundamental principles that should govern European security. And Walter was quite right in referring to those instruments like Helsinki Final Act. Now the question is, how would international community react to a situation in which there is some sort of a ceasefire and later on acceptance of a change of international recognized borders for the sake of reaching a peace agreement? This is a critical question that needs to be addressed by the international community, I think.
Thank you. Margarita?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry, you're going to be the last on the list after Sven.
Well, there were a lot of discussions, and yesterday I was at the other event also discussing with some people working in Ukraine, having business in Ukraine, so we were having the same question. Will it be the situation which would be satisfying for both sides? And my sense is that, you know, the administration and those people who are more informed, I'm not talking about the whole society, that's another question, they basically, for them, it would be okay if the borders would be restored until 2022, February 24. That could be a deal, plus EU membership and plus security guarantees. And today we had a discussion again about the same issue, and it seems that for Russia, the most important thing is to keep what would be victory for what could be a loss for Russia if they lose Donetsk and Lugansk. So I think that there is some room for potential negotiation, but I don't think that this is the time, because still the operation is going on and Ukrainians are winning, and there is a lot of expectation in the society, and well, the expectation of the society could be the major challenge for the administration to sit and negotiate, because now the expectations are high when the Ukrainians are winning. They also are talking about the return of Crimea, etc. But the problem with these regions that most Ukrainians which are pro-Western, they have already left these regions. So what is left? These people are not, would not be committed to create independent pro-Western Ukrainian state. So that's a question. Regarding Germany, I can answer, but I'm just going to leave the floor for Bob.
My answer is on the, can there be a situation where both Ukraine and Russia say that they have won? We should do anything possible in order to avoid the situation where Russia would feel, and Russian society would feel, that the aggression pays off. Because then we will, that will not be the end. There will be another one, there is another one. If we have learned anything in Europe from 1930s, this is that aggressor is not stopping. He has to be stopped. And if we don't, this is the start of a very long series of wars, and so I think even do not want to contemplate a situation where Russia thinks and society thinks it has won.
Very quick comments. if the question is it possible? Then the question on both sides is not only can we imagine it, but is it politically sustainable? In the case of Russia, I don't think, as for the reasons I mentioned before, I think it's very unlikely that as long as Putin is there, that he would accept anything that that didn't look like a major victory of some sort. If he falls under the bus, I can imagine people making the case, and it's the only case I can think of that would have any political resonance inside Russia, which says, look, we've protected the Russophones. That was part of their rationale. They had many others. They had much more ambitious objectives, but that was part of it, and it's not inconceivable to me. Even if that's the case, it's very hard for me to imagine a circumstance like that would be politically sustainable for any strong government in Ukraine, starting with Mr. Zelensky's government. I think there had been some speculation very early after February 24th that maybe Mr. Zelensky would be open to some kind of arrangement. I don't know if that was true or not, but it became clear very, very early that he couldn't sustain it politically at home. So do I think it's impossible that we'd see something like this? No, I think under current circumstances, very unlikely. If it happens, it would be limited to some subsection of the Donbass and would require probably a much weaker government in Ukraine and a different government in Russia.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, very much. Do we still have 1-2 questions? We have about 9 minutes left for the discussion. Yes, please.
I would like to ask questions to Lithuanian and Estonian panelists. So you talked about the Madrid Summit deliverables were historic. What do you think about Vilnius Summit? What do you think? What do we still need for the deliverables?
What is the homework for Vilnius, right? Maybe let's go in the reverse order this time, right? So I kind of presuming that this could have been the last question. So Walter, if you would start first, and then Sven, and we go. The microphone.
So what's the homework for Vilnius? My perspective is don't just think about the transatlantic relationship. As I said, that's very strong. It should be consolidated, and somebody else said we can't take it for granted, not least because of elections in the United States. But also keep an eye open on the broader pan-European security structure. There are plenty of countries that are not in NATO that don't want to be forced to make a choice between relations only with Russia or only with the EU and NATO. That we have to look at that space for countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus, Western Balkans. Strikes me that the OSCE is the place to have that conversation, but also keep it in mind in the work of NATO.
And Carlis, I understand this is the last time I can talk here, so I will.
But you have enough time now.
If you allow, I will also say something which is not directly related to a question about the Vilnius summit. As I said, the Madrid summit decisions were historic, including the new strategic concept. The old one was quite horrific. Russia as a strategic partner and so forth. So it's a good time to do a new strategic concept from our perspective. And in terms of EFP and NATO's presence, all that, a lot of decisions, but now it's the implementation phase. So I hope that at Vilnius we can say that those things have all been implemented. We have brigade structures, we have divisional headquarters ready. The command and control system is done. I'm talking about specifically this region. Of course, that Finland and Sweden are members of NATO. And that also the overall kind of NATO machinery is well on track in basically putting everything which has been agreed into reality, because I mean, frankly, NATO countries are quite thin in terms of defense resources, in terms of forces, in terms of capabilities, equipment, and this is in a way a long-term thing to fix. This is not going to be fixed by Vilnius Summit. Maybe the next Vilnius Summit in 20 years. My last point is the following: that we have seen. If you remember back about maybe 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of articles, a lot of discussion that how effective the autocracies are, and democracies have so many internal contradictions. It takes a long time to agree on something. There's a lot of squabbles and so forth. So what do we have seen now in a conflict, military conflict between autocracy and a democracy? Democracy is winning every day because it can autocorrect. It has a mechanism of autocorrection. People participate, take initiative, and they basically this kind of the overall societal resilience is of a different magnitude than in autocracy. As someone said, on Twitter probably, but I think very well, is that the crucial mistake what Putin made was to send slaves to liberate free people. And I think this is basically, he has now learned at his own peril. And last point on a kind of the energy, and winter is coming. We have seen now a Russian diplomat saying, you know, but don't you forget that winter is coming. Which is, I mean, maybe we should advise them to have another look at the Game of Thrones. That kind of depicts them as the zombies from the other side of a wall. I don't think this is really what they meant by it. But this is telling that we are using such metaphors right now as a kind of a blackmailing tactic. But I will use one of a few German expressions I know in order to say that everything is going to correct or to be all right with energy and with winter. And this is wir schaffen das. We will manage. We will manage, and why? It's because we are living in vibrant societies with vibrant democracies, capitalist system, free enterprise, and there's going to be a lot of money to be made on a green transition, all that kind of stuff. And people will find a way because we are free people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven.
Can I just comment? The Russians should remember the 1939 Finnish Winter War.
Yeah, we do.
Sven, just a small moderation note. I love your last point. I counted 7, your last points that you were making. Tachan, please.
Well, first of all, the summit declarations are very useful to not only inform the experts community what the leaders decided upon, but also gives the necessary homework to be done by individual allied nations. So in terms of having the reset, shifting our focus to collective defense, these are all good, and I'm sure that until Vilnius summit meeting, all these elements should be delivered. But since we also talk about 360-degree approach, we should not lose sight of the importance of looking to other directions. Take, for instance, the South. Challenges, threats emanating from the South. Russia is also in the South. So if we are sort of fixated with Russia, we should have every reason to have our focus to that direction as well. We talked about China, and strategic concept will give us the necessary basis on which to calibrate our assessment regarding China. It's a challenge, for sure, But as the 2019 London Leaders Meeting declaration says, we should approach China not only from challenges perspective, but from opportunities perspective. This requires engagement, proper engagement. I'm not suggesting establishing NATO-China Council, but proper engagement would be necessary. And one last thing I would like to emphasize is we are talking about capabilities, the importance of capabilities. NATO should invest more on technology cooperation, especially military technology cooperation among allies. So emerging and disruptive technologies, innovation should be in the heart of the work of NATO. But this also relates to NATO-EU cooperation. And for this cooperation to be fulfilling, there are three principles that I would highlight. First, NATO should remain as the cornerstone of European defense. Strategic autonomy idea should be interpreted as strategic responsibility. Second, capabilities. These are fantastic. This is a fantastic area of cooperation because with strategic responsibility, if EU is going to deliver more capabilities, then non-EU allies should also be involved in certain projects like PESCO, European Defence Fund. And my last point would be that NATO-EU cooperation in the years to come should not be the hostage of certain political issues, and this requires some sort of recognition of the need to overcome them, and I hope that there will be a political will in that respect.
Thank you. Thank you. Bob and Margarita, we are out of time. May I kindly ask you to be... No, I would not dare that, but just a bit shorter.
Well, the most common lie I've ever heard in sessions like this is the phrase, "I will be brief," but I will try to be brief. There's plenty more to say about Russia, but as the American in the room, I think I should say a few words very quickly about the question of the U.S. commitment, given the comments that I've heard. I entirely understand why Europeans are nervous about this, given Mr. Trump and what we're seeing. But I think you can relax somewhat, at least about this. A couple reasons. Number one, I don't think he's going to be president. Even if he's not indicted, his numbers are going down, even in the Republican Party. There's a strong core, but it's not right now of support, but it's around 33-35%. Indeed, if I had to bet, my bet would be he's not going to get the Republican nomination. But let's assume I'm wrong. Let's assume he's president. I just asked you to look back at when he was president, when he actually said, let's get out of NATO, and he did, and we didn't. Why? Because the senior military said, we'll all resign, and because his staff told him, you're going to get impeached. And the same thing would happen. So I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about is the fact that right now, and I'm sorry to say this, is that although there is tremendous bipartisan support for NATO and for the transatlantic relationship, this is the most partisan, polarized political environment in the U.S. than I can recall. And so what I worry about more is simply political paralysis. That's a bigger problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a very valuable comment.
Okay, thank you. I really will be brief. So I'm just going to wrap up what has already been said. So what would be a successful Madrid summit? So all the promises made in Madrid fulfilled, not paper armies, but real commitments. That's number one. Sweden and Finland are members of NATO by that time. And now I'm just going to challenge you a bit. And the war in Ukraine is over. So I think that's going to be a recipe for success.
Thank you, Margarita. You actually nicely took the job from me of summarizing this whole away. I'm very thankful for that because we are out of time. Really, there's coffee and snacks available. Thank you all for coming, but most importantly, a big round of applause to the wonderful panel that we have.